Hello and welcome to myNewsWrap. Another Friday, another time for some news from the SAP and Microsoft area. So let's see what this week brought to us with respect to news. So let's start with the SAP side of the house. So first of all, I want to raise your attention to one blog post by Jürgen Müller, who wrote some explanation around the topic of low-code and no-code development. I think based on the facts on the acquisitions that have been made in the last few weeks. So he elaborates a bit on low-code, no-code, and then he kind of also draws the attention to how Signavio fits into the game and how AppGyver fits into the game, but also what kind of surprised me, he also mentioned the Mendix partnership. So still, Mendix seems to be an important player when it comes to the low-code topic in the SAP ecosystem. I mean, it's a more generic blog post, but quite nice to see the point of view of SAP and their strategy with respect to low-code and no-code. Then we have another blog post by Tobias Hoffmann, this time on a very interesting area when it comes to gaining knowledge, so training. And within the blog post, Tobias compares the options that you have when you are trying to gain skills in Microsoft Azure in specific, and the learning journey experience on the SAP side. And well, to make a long story short, so it's quite easy to get or to gain knowledge in the Azure environment for basically zero cost. You get a lot of vouchers at the moment for exams. So you can really easily onboard onto the Microsoft world without too much ado. And SAP is the complete opposite to that topic. And well, when you read the blog post, I mean, I've referenced it in the show notes, you will also see that there are quite some comments on that one. So that really hits a spot in the SAP ecosystem. There was also some chit chat on Twitter, where also the chief learning officer of SAP chimed in. But well, there have been quite some, let's say, points that have been proposed at TechEd, and up to now we did not see too much become reality. So I hope SAP will take that serious, because that's really, it's all about enabling folks. So Microsoft is doing quite a much better job on that area. AWS, by the way, too. Okay, away from the generic topics, let's switch to the business technology platform. There is basically one news from an, let's say, administrative side that I think is quite interesting. You can now get your balance statement via SAP for Me on the SAP Business Technology platform. So you can now really see how much did you spend, and in a self-service fashion. And this blog post that I referenced describes how to do that and what you get as an outcome. The first balance statement that you can fetch in that manner is December 2020. So all the prior expenses are not available up to now, but since December 2020 and up to now, you can use this feature, which makes the business technology platform a bit more mature, also in this aspect that's kind of usual stuff on all the other hyperscalers. Then there is a blog post series that was published and that I think I did not highlight around the business technology platform, with an end-to-end showcase that is more focusing on, let's say, data-based scenarios. So it's all around SAP HANA Cloud. SAP Data Warehouse. What's interesting is there is also one blog post about continuous integration and deployment pipelines when you work with that stuff. So it's really an full-fledged description or blog post series about such an end-to-end showcase. That's really cool. So if you're working with SAP HANA Cloud or in that area, I think, then this blog post series might be quite of value for you. Then let's switch to Kyma. And there are two news. One, I want to highlight an entry in the roadmap of Kyma runtime on SAP Business Technology Platform. And here in the roadmap, you can see that the on-premise extension building making use of Kyma will be enabled in the second quarter of 2021 using cloud platform connectivity. So that's really cool, because now then you can really make use of the let's say eventing stuff on the on-premise side and make use of Kyma. So I think there are quite some nice scenarios where you can benefit from that. Unfortunately, so I put the link in the show notes, but as you might know, the Roadmap Explorer is a gated experience, so what you need is an S user in order to get access to the information. No idea why that is the case, but if you really want to dive into it, you have to have an S user. Then there was a second blog post that came out yesterday about adding authentication via the XSUAA binding in Kyma runtime. That blog post describes how you can handle XSUAA within the Kyma runtime, how to create the instance and do all the stuff. Quite extensive description, also referencing a GitHub repo, so you can really walk through that. I did not really wrap my head around that, but what I saw, it's a little bit strange because you use kind of volume mounts in order to get your hands on the XSUAA app router. So I think I have to dig deeper. Maybe something for my Learning Kyma series. What I also want to highlight is there are some further readings down there, and there is one very specific reading around deploying cloud application programming applications on Kyma, which is also a full-blown tutorial around deploying such an application into Kyma, of course, with the, let's say, restriction that you need a HANA database that is available within trial, but I mean, for productive environments, I don't know if I always need a HANA. With that, that's all that I saw in the SAP world with news. So let's switch to Microsoft and, of course, to Azure Functions. And yesterday evening, there was an Azure Functions Live special edition, I would call it, about the .NET roadmap. As I already elaborated in prior podcasts, there is kind of this delay with respect to .NET 5.0, which is now available for Azure Functions. But there are some points that you have to take into account, and there are some changes with respect to how .NET functions will be integrated into the Azure environment. Let's say it that way, and how things will move forward from there, so that .NET 6 and .NET 7 will be supported much earlier than that was the case for .NET 5. This is kind of explained within this Azure Functions Live Special Edition. And there are also tons of demos, what you have to consider when you do now function development with .NET 5. There are also some questions in there that have been brought into, as it was a live stream. So if you're working with functions, if you're working with .NET 5, then this is something that you do not want to miss. Then there is one GitHub repo in the context of Azure Functions that I want to highlight, and that's all about serverless and the CQRS pattern and how to implement it with serverless and with Cosmos DB. So that's really cool. The README is not really extensive, so for those who watch this, it's nothing. But you cannot take a look at the sources. It's quite self-explanatory. It's a really a slim use case. So yeah, if you want to wrap your head around CQRS and how to implement that with Azure Functions or with serverless offerings on Azure, then this GitHub repo might be your go-to resource. Yeah, that's already it from the serverless side of Microsoft. Then I have quite some, let's say, news from different sources around Microsoft. There is one podcast that I would like to highlight where focus on DevOps. That's how the podcast is called. And it's all about Microsoft and how Microsoft is engaging in the open source area. And it's with two guests from Microsoft, two cloud solutions architects, Christian Denig and Andreas Mock, who are part of the cloud solution architecture team that is enabling partners in the Microsoft area. And yeah, I mean, Microsoft is quite heavily engaging with open source, so this is definitely worth hearing. Then 2 points from a more, let's say, administrative perspective on Azure. One important topic from my perspective is, well, budgeting, because stuff costs at Azure. So how do you want to, how can you prevent these budget problems on Azure so that you run across a certain amount, and especially not only in the backside. So of course you can do some budget alerts in there, and you can then get emails whatsoever. But what you want to do is you want to have a really early alert with some forecasting of the costs. And this blog post that I referenced here exactly describes this scenario, how you can prevent your exceeding your Azure budget by such forecasted alerts. Then, as I said before, Cosmos DB, one very important part, especially when you work with Azure Functions, but they are not easy to calculate when it comes to costs. And this cost calculator that I referenced is nothing new, but I kind of stumbled across it in the last week. So maybe it's also new for you. There is a little cost calculator that allows you to estimate your DB costs based on the settings of your Cosmos DB. So you can really play around with all the little knobs that you have within Cosmos DB, like which API do you use, how much reads do you have, how much creates, updates, deletes do you have, how big are your items that you're working with, and then get a quite detailed calculation of your costs, which should then also quite fit your real costs, because that's kind of something. It's I wouldn't call it a science, but it's not trivial if you do it the first time, calculating costs with Cosmos DB. Then let's switch to the, let's say, DevOps part. There is there was one really cool live stream this week around DevOps with GitHub from ground up. So I referenced the live stream in the show notes, where there's really the explanation, how do you do DevOps with GitHub starting from zero. So that's cool. Then another topic around DevOps in the broadest sense. As you know, Azure Bicep is getting more and more traction. And now, as we have a version 0.3 released, it's now officially supported by Microsoft. So it's an easier way to describe your infrastructure as code. We all know in Azure we have the ARM templates, so the Azure Resource Manager templates, but Azure Bicep is more abstract layer on top of that and makes life easier. And here is one blog post that I think gives you kind of a kickstart when it comes to role definition that you want to deploy to Azure. With that, I would like to switch to the world between SAP and Microsoft. There was just one story that crossed my path, but that's also quite interesting scenario. And that's using Azure CDN, so Content Delivery Network, for SAP UI5 libraries. And the scenario, I think, is a quite realistic one. So if you're using SAP Fiori, you have, let's say, two types of content. You have the static content and the dynamic content. And the delivery of the static content might be a bottleneck, depending on how your company structured the system. So let's say you have a central SAP system, and then you have access to that system from very, very different points of the world. Then making use of a CDN is really a game changer, because you have simply longer access times when you access a system from, let's say, Australia that is located in Germany. So this blog post now describes how you can mitigate that by making use of Azure CDN in order to allow a very fast access to the static content. Yeah, that's, I think, one very valid scenario and quite helpful when you're working in that area. With that, I would like to switch to the next topic, education and learning. There is quite some stuff that's coming up in the near and not so near future. One thing is an SAP event that will take place at the end of March. And it's called Ask Us Anything SAP Business Technology Platform. So it's a LinkedIn event. So you can go there and basically ask anything about SAP Business Technology Platform, I guess. Let's see if you get answers. No, just kidding. So I think that's quite a good format, and especially when it comes to business technology platform, that's really necessary to hopefully have an open exchange with folks from SAP. Then from the area of Microsoft Learning, there is one blog post on the .NET side of the house about cloud-native learning resources for .NET developers, and that kind of is another proof how Microsoft deals with enabling developers versus how SAP deals with enabling developers. So if you scroll through that, you have tons of tutorials about how to deploy .NET applications in a cloud-native way to Azure. You have the learning modules that are available, and there are really a lot of free books all around the way of containerizing .NET applications, building serverless apps, or what I also referenced here, how to use Dapper for .NET developers. So yeah, great resource, great write-up. If you want to make your hands dirty in that area, I think that's a great starting point. Then this Sunday we will have another lesson from the Azure Functions University. And this time it's all around configuration and app settings. So that's really something that I'm personally looking forward to, because that's a really interesting topic, what you can achieve by just making the right configurations within your Azure Functions. Then one last, let's say, Twitter handle that I would like to highlight in the context of learning is Azure Lessons. That's I don't know who is doing that, but they are really giving you access to a lot of cool blog posts from the area of Azure and also from the area of really serverless. So there are a lot of blog posts around Azure Functions. So as you can see here, if you watch the video, I followed that one, and I think that's really valuable content that's coming from there. Okay, yeah, let's go to the last topic of this week, developer productivity, with a very, very special topic. For those of you who are working with Kubernetes, with different Kubernetes clusters, you probably know that switching between Kubernetes clusters or cluster contexts is really a pain. And especially it might also be a security issue if you have all the contexts of or the config files also located locally on your machine. And this blog post tells you how to mitigate that by allowing you to access Azure the configs or context stored in the Azure Key Vault to use them on your local machine, and this way to switch between the Kubernetes clusters. So that is really something that is super helpful. It's making use of basically all the tools that you anyway have in place when you're working with Azure. So if you're dealing with stuff in that area, then take a look, especially if you're not only dealing with, let's say, playground AKS clusters, but if you're really using productive environments, then take a look at this blog post. Yeah, with that, I'm through with all the news from this week. I hope I had some topics for you that were interesting, where you want to make a deeper dive into them. With that, I wish you a nice Friday. I wish you a nice weekend. And see you next week. Till then, bye.